Hello and welcome everybody to this second workshop of the Junior Faculty Forum for Indian Law Teachers. Before I say a bit about the JFF, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, I want to extend a special thanks to our three conveners, Ms. Swati Singh Parmar, who is an assistant professor at Dharamshastra National University in Jabalpur. Mr. Prakash Meena, who is an assistant professor at Delhi University. And Dr. Animesh Das, who is an assistant professor at St. Xavier's University, Kolkata. All three of them have been fantastic in helping launch and run this forum and put in a tremendous amount of work behind the scenes in order to make this possible. So thank you all very much. And thank you also to all the participants who have joined us. Now, today we are going to discuss a paper by Mr. Surendra Kumar. Mr. Kumar is a graduate of the RML NLU at Lucknow, and then he did his LLM at SOAS and MPhil at JNU, Delhi. And he's currently at Jindal Global University as a lecturer at Jindal. Our discussant today is Dr. Shreya Atrey. She is the Associate Professor in International Human Rights Law at the University of Oxford. Thank you very much, Shreya, for joining us. We're very grateful for you for your kindness in helping us discuss Surendra's paper. Now, about the JFF, we hope to be a forum to workshop papers from early career scholars from India and South Asia more generally. We want to provide a forum where the discussion can be robust, but we also want it to be kind and constructive, where the goal of the criticism is to help the author to make the paper as good as it can be, and the point is not to prove that you are particularly clever or that you can deal with, you don't need to prove anything here. You just need to help the author in question. So that's the objective of the JFF. And without further ado, I just want to give a brief description of the format. We don't have paper presentations. The author does not present the paper. We take the paper as read by the author, which means that the discussant will launch into the paper directly with her criticisms and praise. Shreya will speak for between 10 to 15 minutes, after which Surendra will have about 5 minutes of time to reply. I might add in some of my comments as chair. If any of the participants want to ask a question, please send them in the chat box. Over to you, Shreya.
Thank you so much, Tarun, and thank you to the conveners for organizing the Junior Faculty Forum. It's an absolutely fantastic endeavor, and I really hope it thrives. We'll have to, Surendra, thank you so much for your paper. I was so excited to read it and enjoyed it greatly, because it touches on one of the most interesting and important debates of our times, the link between racism and casteism. So over the last few years, especially the last few months, this topic has been at the forefront of how we think about race, as is reflected in the buzz created around Isabel Wilkins's new book called Caste: The Lies That Divide Us. What is exciting and truly innovative about your paper is that you're not drawing the race-caste analogy to say something about race, but that you're trying to say something about caste, and in the process, illuminating the nature of casteism as a form of racism. So in the main, I think this paper is about casteism, how it could be seen as an aspect of race discrimination and hence prohibited across context, since race discrimination seems to be prohibited almost everywhere. So the paper uses examples from the US, UK, European, and international law to show how caste can be considered as an aspect of race, hence an analogous ground of discrimination, where caste itself is not a ground of discrimination. I think there are several other running threads in the paper, but this to me is the most significant one, and the one that I think has tremendous potential to contribute to equality and discrimination law. I'll make my substantive comments surrounding this theme, and I hope it will help think through and bring together some of the key points that you make in the paper. I also think all papers, when they workshop, are rather different. So some are just an idea, some are second or third drafts, some are exploratory. I think yours really is exploring a vast terrain, and I want to make mainly substantive comments to help streamline the paper and realize its vast potential. But first, let me say what struck me the most when I read the paper. I was struck by the sheer amount of references which populate the footnotes. Surendra, your familiarity with literature is impressive, and I commend the breadth of research and thought that has gone into the paper. But I think that the familiarity with the range of debates contributes to the paper having too many moving parts as well. Caste, race, COVID are truly going to serve you and your central argument, and use just those in making that central argument with clarity and precision. Leave out everything else. You can write several papers from the many themes you explore here and the sheer amount of knowledge you have in the subject area. So let's think about the central argument together. So the central argument is, say, one key thought that a paper seeks to further. That thought needs to be stripped down. It can be a complex one. It needn't be a bare one. And it can accommodate many layers within it, but it has to be clear. What makes it clear are two things. One, stating it clearly, and second, establishing it clearly. I'll say something about the second in just a moment, but just on the first point, it is important to identify and expressly state the central argument very clearly up front. On my reading of the paper, I think the central argument is to do with casteism as a form of racism, which can be conceived as universally prohibited. It will help here to be clear as to where this central argument is located, and there are several options. So first, is the central argument located at the normative level? That is, if we think about how things should be, then casteism conceptually is similar to or comparable to racism. That has little to do with how things are on the ground in law. Your main concern, if you embrace establishing something normative about our thinking on casteism, would be to think about the structure of casteism and racism and the kind of hierarchical and disadvantageous relationships they produce and entrench. You would essentially be doing the opposite of Cass Sunstein's 1994 article, The Anti-Caste Principle, by drawing on the nature of caste to link it to race, while Sunstein seems to have been doing the opposite. On the other hand, secondly, the central argument could be located within law, especially Indian constitutional law. But that would be trite. Both caste and race are prohibited grounds of discrimination anyway under Article 15.1. So then what would the article be showing in respect of Indian law at all? Perhaps, thirdly, the central argument could be located within comparative law to show that caste in jurisdictions where it's not explicitly included, say the US or the UK, can be considered included given that it has been interpreted as a matter of race. Or fourthly, it could be located at the international level to show that in the human rights, the UN Human Rights Treaty body system, there's an inclusion of race discrimination, which means an inclusion of caste discrimination being prohibited. And finally, fifthly, the central argument could be located across these registers and would have to clarify how they interact. I think, Surendra, your paper is doing the fifth thing of seeing how caste across these multiple registers is really a category of race discrimination, both conceptually and in legal doctrine, in India, in comparative law, and in international law. And if this is the case, it would help to state the central argument in this way. Let me say something about the narrative, which is, say, having a clear flow of establishing a central argument from point A to B, going through points X, Y, and Z, using evidence 1, 2, and 3. So how do you imagine this as a flow or flow chart of some kind? So one of the key aspects of building the central argument would be sticking to a thought from one sentence to the next and from one paragraph to the next, and then in turn as a whole throughout the paper. This almost clinical devotion to carrying out an argument with logic and with unity across the narrative will bring some of the very important arguments you make in the paper together. Let me give an example. If you reimagine part 1 of your paper as setting out a case of universalization of caste, that no matter where you're located, casteism reproduces itself in India and beyond, you're opening the reader to a rather novel argument that casteism seems to be a kind of discrimination which transcends context, and unlike the status quo, where it is only largely believed to be confined to India, it exists, it thrives everywhere. This argument would then allow you to reorient part 2 of the paper to use ideas around race and racism as capable of accommodating this universalization of caste idea. This, though, has to be done on a more accurate rendering of racism, one that debunks and steers clear from eugenics or any notion of biological race, as you already do. This should give ample space to construct a common social framework of racism and casteism. This will lay the groundwork for the analysis of doctrine in part 3 of the paper, and in particular, focusing on the doctrine in India especially, and the Supreme Court decision in Safai Karmchari Andolan, and how the position of the government has continued to evolve since the last 6 years. It would be useful here to parse the logic of the Supreme Court decision systematically, to show how starkly it comports with the government line. It would be useful here to also say that how far the constitutional law itself goes as embodied in the Equality Code under Articles 14 and 18 and under Articles 21 and 23 as you go on to show. This would help develop what you call, and I quote, the grammar of discrimination and transformative potential of the Constitution. Your analysis going over each fundamental right becomes so important and helpful at this stage. I think this is particularly a strong part of the paper, but its link to race can be strengthened still. Use each of the rights to say something about the character of racism and casteism. So it is here that it would help to show how each of the fundamental rights from 15 to 17 to 21 have embedded the logic of universalization of caste as a form of race discrimination, and that it permeates all rights. How do you do this? Say, for example, it would be helpful to state the relevance of analogizing caste discrimination, taking the example of Sabrimala, to show that such analogizing from caste to gender has already been done and would have a similar basis in the context of race too. But why would it be significant? Or as Tarun would ask, so answer the so what question. I think it would be significant to build a wider base of discrimination by imagining casteism as racism, because it would help include aspects of rurality, regionality, language, poverty, class, aspects relevant to discrimination in India and beyond, which racism seems to respond more intuitively better to than in terms of casteism, which is reduced and has a rather shrunk definition within the Indian context. So what I'm saying is this: your current analysis in this part is focused on manual scavenging as an instance of violation based on caste. It's helpful, but it would also be helpful to connect the dots with the rest of the paper and make a case for manual scavenging as discrimination based on caste, of course, but as possibly more broad-based in terms of the vocabulary of race discrimination and human rights under the Constitution. I think the argument is there. It just needs to be spelled out explicitly. Once this is done, you would have built a narrative around a central argument leading up to some pointed work to be done in part 4 of the paper. You're right to inaugurate this part by thinking about European Union law and its engagement with race discrimination, which seems rather at odds with caste discrimination in India. Now, it would be useful to grapple with the logic of this difference, which is very closely linked to your central argument about the link between race and caste. Here's the difference. While Europe does not reckon with caste or caste discrimination in its law, it does reckon with race and race discrimination as such. It wholly denies that race or races exist. And so it goes on to prohibit race discrimination, which is thus deemed to not exist either. Race and races do not exist from the word go. The EU Race Directive 2043 is telling in this regard, where only the terms racial or ethnic origin or racism exist. No mention of race is made, except for in the preamble, which declares, and this is a powerful quote, and I quote, "The European Union rejects theories which attempt to determine the existence of separate human races. The use of the term racial origin in this directive does not imply an acceptance of such theories." We can now appreciate what it may take to argue casteism as a form of racism. You deny the existence of caste per se. The Indian Constitution doesn't quite get there. The argument would have to begin by denying this completely then. And just as a way of denying race, you'd have to deny caste and any perceived discrimination based on caste or racial discrimination. The same logic would have to apply, say, in the case of the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination, all forms of racial discrimination, the CERD, which too prohibits racial discrimination in all its forms. But the starting point is, and again, it's a powerful preambular clause which doesn't exist in any of the other human rights treaty. Compare it to the Women's Convention or any other. Here's what it says, that any doctrine of superiority based on racial differentiation is scientifically false, morally condemnable, socially unjust, and dangerous. And that there's no justification for racial discrimination in theory or practice anywhere. We really come to see just how different the European and international discrimination law is situated on race. It refuses to go into any discussion of what race is, and it denies any idea of racism to exist on the idea of races or racial origin from the outset. Compare it to the Indian Constitution, which bans untouchability and caste discrimination, no doubt, but does not abolish caste per se. In fact, we go on and on about our discussions on caste discrimination, about caste system and caste per se, without being clear that the two, caste and discrimination based on caste, are really two very different things. The former and any discussion of its makeup, that is of caste as caste, should be expunged wholly. And that's what the analogy with racism and race discrimination tells us. And here is where you can really use Safai Karmchari Andolan to tell us something about why the Indian law has gone the way it has. We just haven't gotten to the point of denying the existence of caste and caste system. If we were there, Safai Karmchari Andolan would have looked very different. It wouldn't just try to rationalize caste system and hence rationalize race discrimination or caste discrimination. It would begin from a different starting point, and it would be obvious that manual scavenging could not possibly exist in the 21st century. But we haven't gotten there. But we could get there if we draw the analogy about racism quite sensitively and quite substantively. So I think there's good reason to align European Union and international law on this subject with the Indian law. And I think there's great potential in spelling out what the caste race analogy can mean, and to really make a case of universalization of caste discrimination, which I think is really the talk of the town, with the talk of race discrimination, constantly learning from caste discrimination. I think you're trying to do the opposite, and I think it's absolutely commendable. And I would really hope that this paper develops into doing just that. So I welcome you to do that, but that's all from me for now. Congratulations on the paper. Thank you for sharing it, and I look forward to seeing how it develops.
Thank you very much, Shreya, for those kind comments. I want to add a few more comments to Shreya's excellent take on Surendra's paper, which I agree, its biggest virtue is just a vast amount of reading Surendra has clearly done for this paper. Having said that, so I'm taking everything, all the praise that Shreya has legitimately piled in the paper is given, because time is short and we want a discussion to go on. I'm going to focus on a few criticisms. The first is that this is a really long paper with too many moving parts, and Shreya alluded to that as well. This is one of the most common issues as an editor of a journal, as somebody who reads a lot of scholarship from early career scholars. It is something I see very commonly in many early career scholars' work. So Surendra, you're absolutely not alone in trying to take on so much, but it's an early career scholar's disease, right? And this is in my mind, to my mind, the psychology behind it. Right? You have been in the academy for 10, 15 years now, seriously thinking, seriously reading. You're clearly intelligent. That's why people, make it in the academy, get a job. And there are all these ideas and thoughts that have been bubbling away for so long, right? Desperate to come out. And finally, you start writing your first paper and you want to put everything clever that you've thought of in that one paper, right? So I understand the instinct, but resist it, because this is not the only thing you will write. This is the first thing you're going to write. And you will write a lot over time. It's really important to focus, especially in your early work, because you want to focus to say less and carefully let your ideas develop, and know that 4 or 5 years from now you'll be a different person with not different views but more mature views, more sophisticated views. So taking it easy when writing, when putting your thoughts in print, is important, because there will be a time when I look back at my early work and think, yeah, maybe I've never written that, right? And that'll happen anyway, especially if you're improving as a scholar, but take it easy, right? And I'm saying that is not to say that what's in this paper is not helpful. It's extremely insightful and you have all these nuggets. But so just building upon that first thought, which is this paper is trying to do far too much. It's way too long and it has many different moving parts. I think it's 3 or 4 different papers at least, right? It could even be a lifetime's agenda. So how do you sharpen a paper? So here are the things I see in the paper, and Shreya has already alluded to some of them. One key theme that Shreya helpfully picked up and focused on is the discussion with the politics of race. Right? Now there are already many facets to that discussion. So one of the things that Dr. Atrey explained was that the discussion on race itself is different in different places, right? So discussion on race in the Anglosphere, in the UK and the US, is very different from what it looks like in continental Europe, right? Where the dilemma that Shreya explains is, how do you deal with race discrimination when you're not prepared to accept, because of Europe's very particular history with the Holocaust, right? When you're not prepared to accept that race exists. Right? And this question of existence is a complicated one. There is an easy answer to it, right? At least in the scholarly sense, there's an easy answer, which is that race clearly is not a biological reality, but it is a social reality, right? And there are different types of realities. A piece of paper becomes money, not because of any inherent feature of it. It's a social reality, right? Currency is a social reality. Similarly, race, if people accept certain things to be real, then some things become real, right? The trouble is that this is an emotive question in Europe, and that kind of nuance is difficult, right? So even when you're doing this caste and race comparison, you need to choose and hone into what dimension of the race discourse you're dealing with, right? Because the discourse in the US is very different from the discourse in the UK, is very different from the discourse in continental Europe. There are different dimensions to that. But there's a lot else that's interesting that's going on in this paper. The debate, the question about the Californian case, it's fascinating, right? The discussion of caste discrimination. But that is the question. So, okay, so here let me introduce a lens to figure out how to fine tune and focus a paper. It's very helpful to ask early on, who am I writing this paper for? What is my audience? It may also help to think about what is the forum, what is the venue for this paper, right? Am I writing this for a largely South Asian audience, potentially for a journal like the Indian Law Review? Am I writing this for a largely American audience, potentially for an American Law Review? Am I writing this for a European journal, for a British journal? That will help you. So the Indian South Asian interest in the American case, there is a significant scholarly interest, but it's not a practitioner's interest, right? Whether the American Civil Rights Act can be interpreted so that race in that context includes caste is of primary interest to a different audience from the interest on the Indian Supreme Court case on the Safai Karamchari case that you discussed, right? And even in that case, right? So it was difficult to see upfront, and I'm moving to my second criticism and then I will shut up, which is, it is difficult to see when you discuss that case, what precisely is your problem with the case. So if you were writing a critique of the sort of Safai Karamchari case, you would tell us first how the case arose, what were the facts, what was the cause of action, who were the parties, what was the issue at the case, what did the court decide before launching into a criticism. Right? Now, the first time in this paper that I as a reader encounter the case is some criticism of the case. That's already too swift for me. I need to know a lot more before I can get to the criticism, right? So this is also in part an audience question. Are you assuming too much of an audience? And that is something you have to do, even if you're writing for an Indian audience, right? You have to lay the ground carefully, slowly, gently. So I was thinking in that case, while reading that case, okay, there are multiple aspects to the issue of manual scavenging, right? So take the example of torture. Torture is wrong per se, right? Torture at any time is wrong. If you discriminate while torturing, say you decide to torture only people who belong to a particular religion, that is doubly wrong. It's wrong because it's torture, and it's wrong because it's discriminatory. Right? I wanted to know as a reader, what is the wrong in manual scavenging? So part of the argument, it's wrong in itself because it's violating a person's dignity because of the nature of the job. And that will be a wrong, even if discrimination is not involved, arguably, right? And a second issue may be that it's discriminatory. Now, when you make that claim, I need to see as a reader why it's discriminatory. So you have to give me a framework of what counts as discrimination, direct or indirect discrimination. And then you have to show me what it is about the practice of manual scavenging that makes it indirect discrimination. What is its connection with caste? So these elements have to be brought out with a lot more patience. And so this is in sum the second criticism, which is often when we are writing on a topic that, if I have read as widely as you have on this topic, you've clearly completely mapped the literature. It's very easy to forget that the reader does not know as much as you do. Especially if you are a clever person, which you evidently are, it's very easy to forget the things that you take for granted, the things that you as an author assume to be true because you've read so much and because you can see 5 steps ahead. Even an intelligent reader who's not steeped into that literature will not see as easily, will not see as clearly. Right? So part of the process of becoming a scholar, part of the process of writing as a scholar, is to take yourself in some ways out of that literature and acquire that lens of an intelligent but inexpert reader. What are the things that reader needs to see, which is obvious to me? And then you need to labor the point step by step, take the reader through the paces, right? So, and that's why workshops are so important in the process of writing, because workshopping a paper with people who are intelligent and well-meaning, who want to help, but who are not experts in the field, they will ask you precisely the questions that you need to be asked, precisely the kinds of questions that I'm asking. And here I'll make a third point, and I'll leave it at that. And this is a somewhat more sensitive point. But it's a point that needs to be made given what we saw today at the start of this workshop, which is this, that part of the scholarly role is to speak truth to power. Right? Academics often discharge the burden of taking on power because as a profession, we have a truth-telling role. As a profession, our first and only fidelity is to the truth discovered with hard labor, which is why we have, at least some people have, some scholars have the luxury of time, right? I know that most Indian scholars don't have the luxury, but the time, the scholarly time for deep thinking and reading is given to us because it's our job to find out truths that are not obvious, that are not apparent, and to speak it without fear. And therefore, it is to be expected that power will fight back, that there will be backlash, especially when you are tackling the sorts of topics that you are tackling in this paper, right? Topics of caste. Backlash has to be accepted. Some of those things you cannot deal with except by gradually growing a thicker skin, right? It is hurtful, but in some ways that's part of the package, right? If you are a scholar, you've chosen a profession where you put yourself out for criticism, a lot of it will be unfair, right? So part of it is developing a thicker skin and just not dealing with the trolls, right? So there's an emotional labor here as well, and I just want to put it up center because it's clearly the elephant in the room, right? Given the videos that were shared and the comments that were shared, it's important to understand that emotional labor is as much part of the academic enterprise as intellectual labor is, and as other forms of labor is, and it is something that we can only nurture as a community. So becoming resilient as a scholar requires that emotional resilience and finding a community that will take you seriously, but it also requires anticipating. There's some attacks you will just have to learn to ignore and not take seriously. But there's some attacks that will come from within the scholarly community. Sometimes ill-intended, sometimes a pretext for very deep-seated ideas which are motivated by social power. And sometimes out of naivety, and sometimes well-meaning and intelligent, right? Albeit ignorant, right? Sometimes playing devil's advocate. So when the criticism is scholarly, it's helpful not to worry about the motives of your interlocutor, the person you're debating with, unless it's self-evident that they are only in the game for pretextual reasons, right? If they're doing that, if they're playing that game, then it's helpful not to engage. But anything else, it's your duty, even when you write, to anticipate that kind of attack, especially for a paper on caste, right? And it's a sad world that we live in, where the more you seek to challenge power, greater is your burden of justification because of the inevitable backlash you will feel, right? So it's in part a suggestion both for emotional resilience, but also for intellectual resilience, right? That these things should not surprise us. That is the sad reality of the world we live in. So I commend you for writing this paper. It needs a lot more work, but that is not a criticism, because every good paper, I haven't written a paper that I have not workshopped at least 5 times before sending it to a journal. So workshopping with well-meaning, good, helpful people is an absolute essential element of good scholarship. And that's the point of this forum, to provide a supportive but robust network of support. So that's all I want to say. You have some time to respond to anything that Shreya and I might have said, either on the intellectual labor issues or on the substance of anything, or on the emotional dimension of things, or anything else you want to raise about the writing process as an early career scholar. And in the meantime, I will see if there are other comments. I have plenty of questions. myself so we can keep the conversation going. But over to you, Surendra. Unmute yourself first and take your time, 5 to 10 minutes to give a response. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Shreya and Professor Tarun. This has been one of the best experiences I ever had, given the fact that probably this is the first time that this thought has been there for a very long time. This thought actually started back in JNU. And as I said, I mean, there just have been just so many developments which I wanted to reflect, and that to an extent clouded the judgment and the paper. So there are bits and pieces here and there, but one thing which I did not, while I was critiquing and I fell for the same thing, was that the perception of race is very different all across jurisdictions. And I was just looking it through the idea of caste. I mean, I was laboring that point while I basically missed that, like a deer in the headlight, and I did not anticipate or just see that through. So one thing is, I totally agree to most of the things which Professor Shreya said, or rather, actually everything, given the fact that I think she basically did what I read for Professor Gardner back when he expired some years ago, that he used to listen more than what was being said and used to read much more liberally than what was written about, which means basically she has basically put it in a very good perspective and a skeleton format, and I think now I have some or rather a lot of clarity as to how to go about it. But one thing which I did not anticipate was how, while I was talking about, again, as you rightly said, it has many parts, but how I assumed that people would know. I mean, most of the people would know what I'm talking about. Caste is such an issue, everyone has an idea about it, but how does it operate is something, even it was very self-explanatory, because when I started reading, I was very surprised. I mean, the paper of Amkar Joshi and Amit Thorat, and the podcast, I started with the podcast and then I went to the paper on untouchability being practiced all across the communities in India. Now that was very jarring for me, because I did not think, okay, why would untouchables do that to others? Because again, that was the whole idea of shared identity. But then that is what I missed out, is that this stratifications are both vertical and horizontal. And something which I think I should have definitely done, and as Professor Shreya pointed out, is while I was comparing caste in India, I should have also to an extent extended that analogy to race and racism. I mean, it is there, but again, as I write, there has been no discussion. I tried to find very hard through the judgments. My interns, most of them were here, we all tried very hard to find, okay, is there discussion on race or racism in any format? And we could not. I mean, as you very rightly pointed out, it has always been in format of law, policy, and how just because of law it is over. And that is one pitfall I was consciously trying to avoid, and I'm glad that I could, because that exactly is the plank of the argument of the Indian government. Every time they bring up the issue of casteism and how it is some jobs are just caste based discrimination because of descent and occupation, they say like, but what, we have laws. Operationalization of law is something that obviously has not been discussed, but I think I'll have much more to think and rewrite in this, and I'll start unpiecing them, in the sense that while the central argument which I'm making is that obviously one subsumes the other, I think it's equally true the other way around also, especially for Europe and UK. And this unfamiliarity, I mean, I'm also discussing the politics of caste, which I'm not sure it is helping conceptually. But notwithstanding the same, thank you so much. I have taken some notes. I'm going to try and say much, I would say, uh, refine it with actually with both emotional as well as the intellectual labor that has to go. But one thing is how, I mean, when I started rereading the paper after some time, is how there have been some jumps from one idea to the other, and some places they're like really well explained, but others they're just perfunctory with just a footnote. And I think Professor Shreya has brought out those points very well. Uh, so I think yes, I mean she very and that is what I was saying about Professor Gardner. I mean, the five strands of thought, I did not think there were five. I was thinking there was six, or at least 3 to 4. But yes, I think uh, I was trying to do all of them. Yes, but I think I have just basically modeled up like knitting. So the threads go in and out, but I think that the central argument has always to be there, and that is one thing is stating it clearly and establishing it clearly. So I think somewhere it is very implicit, it is not explicit, as Professor Shreya was bringing out. I think I have to put it and labor out there and put it out there. Okay, so this is it. This is what I'm going to talk about, and this is how I'm going to talk about. So both have to be done, I think, simultaneously, and to an extent it is very latent. It is there. It is not very I would say visible throughout, but it comes in bits and pieces, and I think it needs a lot of reorganization. But more than that, I am so grateful to both of you, and especially the junior faculty forum team, who brought fantastic people together, barring some in the very start. Um, and I'm so sorry for the experience for everyone for the very starting one. But not standing the same, thank you so much, both of you. I'll take some time, rewrite, and then probably we will go through it once again and see how it goes. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Surendra. I have a few more questions and a couple of questions also coming in by email. Other participants are welcome to send them as well. Shreya, did you want to say anything by way of response to Surendra?
Thanks. I suppose just one question to Surendra. Both Tarun and I sort of picked on the several things you're trying to do, and Tarun rightly said there could be like 3 or 4 papers there. We're probably putting you on spot, but it would really be helpful to know if after these 40 minutes or so, you think there's one thing which you think is coming through in the discussion which you really want to hone in this paper. What do you want to make this paper about? And if you're given a choice to just pick one, what would that be? So if you have a post-it and I hand it over to you, say, Surendra, write down your central argument, and you just have that like one sentence or two, what would that sentence be?
Do you want to come back on that, Surendra?
Yeah, I think it would be the fact that how when I how it has always been about so both caste and race are one and the same. And I could not have put it better than Isabel Wilkerson, where she says it is in the bones and race is just the skin. And the book of Thorat and everyone, wherein they discuss this whole idea which I had from very start, and that is phenotypical, it is a resemblance, it is how we look at it. And this is where Professor Tarun's equality bill came to rescue. because he mentioned Northeast Indians there. And I was, yes, that is so true. So when I was actually asking everyone, including the interns, to give me examples of racism in India, everyone was like, well, North versus South, because, well, complexion. No, but what would Northeast? And how you have subsumed everything into your own world. So one thing is, if there's only one line, and that is, caste is not dead, castelessness is an egalitarian utopia. So as a Satish Deshpande says, we may someday reach it, but again, it's a privilege. It's not going to happen sometime soon. And yeah, I think.
So Surendra, I'm going to pick that apart briefly to show, I guess, what Shreya is after. So that's a broad normative commitment, right? And well, one is an empirical commitment, the other is a normative one. One is caste as race. I'm not sure whether it's empirical or normative, but anyway, let's take that as given. Now, there are many ways in which caste is race, and many ways in which caste is clearly not race, right? There are different social realities, different histories and contexts. You clearly have certain similarities in mind. So any project that is claiming the similarities will need to make a clearer claim about whether, what is the dimension in which they are similar. But even before that, so that cannot be a thesis for an article, for a journal article, right? That's given the weight of that claim, it's probably more appropriate for a book length treatment, right? If that is the, and so you can see how this exercise is very helpful. Shreya asking you to boil down the entire thesis into one sentence, and if you say caste is race, the first thing that, if I was a supervisor, I would say, look, that's too broad for one article, right? You need, that's a book length project. So you have to zero that down to something far more precise that an article is capable of dealing with, right? So one dimension of that an article could deal with is so an article length engagement would be that caste, that the category of race in the Civil Rights Act in the United States should be read to include caste, right? Now that is attempting to deal with the part of that picture, the big picture, right? But it's not trying to do everything in one article. Another possibility might be, now, one of the greatest insights in this paper is you're showing that this is not about a dominant group and a vulnerable group, this one discriminating against the other. The excellence of the caste system, and by excellence I mean in a thin virtue sense, right? But its resilience is based on the fact that everybody in the caste hierarchy has been given a vested interest in preserving it. Because while there is somebody always above you, there's also somebody always below you. So while you're always kicked at, you also can kick down, right? And that dimension, when you show in the paper and when you say, why are untouchables practicing untouchability, right? That is in some ways the genius of caste that keeps it going, right? Is that also true of race? I'm not sure, right? But when you talk about sameness, maybe the question is not just what caste can learn from race. What can race scholars learn from caste? How do we deal with American politics pitting Asian Americans against Black Americans in political terms? Is that a caste-like strategy of getting two minority groups to fight with? So there's a lot of insight, there's a lot of potential, but you need to commit to the idea that there is one issue that you need to focus on, whether it's manual scavenging, whether it's, because clearly manual scavenging is not an issue in the US. Even in India, caste in certain employment contexts takes a different route, right? So I know that I'm overemphasizing the point, but you really need to focus. So that's one benefit of boiling down your central claim into one sentence is you can see whether its breadth, whether the burden of its justification can be borne by a single paper, or does it require a book, or does it require a lifetime or several lifetimes, right, to discharge that burden. And what you stated is completely inappropriate for one paper, is my sense, just hearing that formula, right? You have to put a lot else to narrow the focus down. The second thing your claim makes me think is, and this is the thing, in the first workshop, we were discussing this. We have a few questions coming in, so I will stop soon and start posing those questions to you. In the last workshop, one of the things we emphasized was to ask the so what question. What matters? Why does this question matter? Even if I succeed in showing this to be the case, what hangs on it? Now, one of the things I worry about is there's so much to think about caste. Why? It seems to me that the race and caste question, now I'm an uneducated, but hopefully intelligent person thinking about this debate, right? I don't know as much as you do about this debate. From the outside, it seems to me there's so much that's much more pressing about caste. Why is he focusing on this race question that does not even affect most people in India? It's it may be a concern for the diaspora, but it's whatever. It just seems that's a pragmatic, real world concern, right? The so what question can be answered simply for scholarly benefits, right? That it's intellectually important to understand, because race has been a paradigm to think about discrimination in so many contexts for so many years that it reveals things to us about caste, and caste can show something to race, right? That itself is enough. But you need to think about the so what question. Are you interested in it strategically? Ask yourself that honestly. Am I interested in the so what question strategically? Because if caste is raised, then the entire gamut of international law arsenal opens up to advocates fighting caste discrimination. Is that what motivates me, right? Give it an honest answer, and that will help you focus. So this one line boiling down of why you care about this question helps with thinking about, can the mode in which I'm writing bear the burden of justification? Why do I care about this question? What is my audience? How do I present it, right? So there, and we can continue workshopping this paper about this paper informally later on to hone in some of these criticisms. But I really think you need to make a choice here, and you're making a choice for this paper, not a choice about your lifetime's work. Right? You'll come to, but what I'm saying is, there's a lot of gold here. These gold nuggets that are thrown around. There's a lot of insight on every page. You need to pick one of them and sort of sharpen it. It needs to go through fire, right? You need to purify it, you need to clarify it, you need to shape it. It'll be hard work, but that focus is what is missing. Okay, I think I've overemphasized this point. So let me move now to some of the questions we have been getting. We have several questions. Let me begin with a question that our one of our conveners, Swati Singh, has posed, which is she's interested in the scientific debate on caste, right? Which you allude to in the paper, whether there is a scientific basis to caste or not. I think that's what she means. And if I can return to the paper, let me see if when you're giving a sociological account, of course, anyway, at some point in the paper, you talk about, whether caste is a scientific biological reality or not, right? And she's asking about, she didn't think it was dealt with clearly. I guess I would add to that, to why do you need to deal with that debate at all? Do you have the expertise to deal with that debate, right? So with science, so it matters. So, if you ask, why do I care about it? What is the audience? That might clarify. But anyway, let me pose Swati's question, which if I read it out, she says there was a corollary drawn between caste and science, but not dealt with clearly. Can you just clarify that a little bit more?
Thank you so much, Swati. So I'm not sure if again, I think I was just drawing, rather I was just saying basically that race does not have any scientific explanation. Caste to an extent was put through a lot of anthropological and sociological understanding through colorism, and to an extent there was this dominant narrative of how you actually can apply race to caste, and that is what most of the colonizers did. But to be honest, I think I really need to read more to definitely answer that question. I am not sure if I will be able to answer that question, which will be anyway beneficial to your understanding for the matter. Unless, I mean, you can always write, and I can definitely pinpoint, because to an extent, I think it is. I have mentioned it somewhere in the paper, but I'm not very sure in what context is this being referred to. Thank you.
So here's my thoughts. So when we think about discrimination and grounds of discrimination, it's not clear whether it's not clear whether can you whether a reality of caste, a biological reality matters to discrimination or not at all, right? So when you think of this debate has happened in the context of sexual orientation, in the context of gender politics, in many other contexts. It's not clear whether in any of these contexts it matters at all whether something is scientific or not. What matters is the biological reality of it. I'm going to, Shreya, did you want to come in for a moment? Do you have something to say? I need to nip out for a moment. We'll finish very shortly, but go on, Shreya. You have to unmute yourself.
Thank you. I think JP has to unmute me every time. I think Suren, one way to respond to that and to discrimination lawyers generally would be to say, unlike sex, gender, sexual orientation, where debates about biology and science of it have happened, what we're trying to do with race and caste is very different, right? So no one is trying to say that there's no sort of reality which is scientific to sex, gender, and sexual orientation. They're saying there may be, but it doesn't matter. Whilst in race and caste, and that's what's salient about this as opposed to other grounds, is that we're really trying to say there is no scientific reality to this. It doesn't exist. Whatever justification which is scientific that we might have come up or be coming up about race and caste, it will be false. Right, and I think that's significant, and that separates it out from other grounds of discrimination. So Tarun is right to say, well, but we have transcended this debate in relation to other grounds. That's true, but for a very different reason. We don't say that actually we think that there may not be any biological differences between men and women, because there are. Pregnancy is one such difference, and we treat them seriously in terms of taking away the disadvantage away from that biological difference. So we treat that scientific difference differently in other grounds, but in caste and race, we deny that it has any existence at all. So I think one way to respond to Swati's question would really be to take a cue from the European and the third line of how race is framed, and to really, every discussion on caste and caste systems just goes on about what's made of caste and casteism, but we never begin from the starting point of denying, as we do for racism, that there is no reality, scientific or otherwise, to race per se, race as race, caste as caste.
Thank you, Shreya. We have another question which is on caste, but it's clear that the author has not read the paper. It's a general question about what reservations have achieved. I'm not going to pose it to you because that's not what your paper is about. So I'm going to ignore that question from Mr. Ahuja. There's a question and a comment from Kanaraj Bhatia, who says, on the one hand, race can learn a great deal from caste, but historically the politics and context of race and caste are dissimilar along ascriptions of identities, modes of violence, hierarchies, and historical ways. And secondly, it's also unique in that both intersect in post-colonial transnational moments, where casteism is practiced in ways that benefit the Desi diaspora, both against Dalit people and anti-blackness colorism. So under the legal framework, does subsuming caste within race or race within caste not create its own complications? Does it not render abstract substantive principles that intersectional discriminatory legal framework can work better with? So let me, I think, add to that worry, which is that I believe that something is lost as well so I get the strategic for advocacy-based reasons why you might want to say that caste is race, right? But caste is the quintessential ground of discrimination, right? It sort of defines disadvantage in such deep ways, social disadvantage, almost definitionally, that it needs, if there's one ground that satisfies whatever criterion you come up with for protecting grounds under discrimination law on its own steam, it's caste, right? So caste does not need any normative crutches to be protected in discrimination. Strategically, it is a worry in other countries which don't have a history of caste, but now are facing caste to bring it in through race, right? But sometimes good strategy makes bad law in the long term. And something may be lost, and Shreya has done a lot of intersectional work on intersectionality between caste, between sort of Dalit, on the Dalit feminism, caste and gender issues. I think that might be something you might want to think about. It's a dimension that's not explored in this paper, so I don't necessarily want you to have to answer this question. I think it's an important question to think about, that there may well be costs to the strategic move of thinking caste and race are the same. There are lots of other questions coming in. Let me pose another one. Did you want to answer? Did either of you want to say anything on that question, on the dangers of conflating caste and race? Yes, go on, Surendra. Actually, before you speak, Surendra, I just want to give an example to illustrate that point. There's a case in the UK called Mandla and Lee. I'm sure you know about this case. I'll just, anyway, it's Mandla versus Lee, Mandla. It's a case about a Sikh student who takes his school to court because the school's uniform policy did not allow him to wear a turban. Now, at that time, when the case was filed, British law prohibited race discrimination, but not religious discrimination. So he could not bring it as a religious discrimination case. So his lawyers strategically and successfully argued it as a case of race discrimination by saying that Sikhs are a race. Right? The strategy is familiar. Right? 40 years later, that case is decided in a Jewish context in ways that many people find problematic. And anyway, because in this case, what is clearly a religious issue is seen as a racial issue because of this precedent, right? So there are unintended consequences to the conflation of religion and race in that case. And I think the worry is that are we also not in danger of losing something by making this strategic move, if this is a strategic move? Did you want to say anything about it?
So I think, I had written it somewhere, but it just got lost. So this was exactly the strategy of India, and rather the Indian delegation, always to deny that if caste cannot fall in third is because caste is not equal to race. But what I, to an extent, argued is, I'm never saying that caste is race, because obviously caste to an extent predates race. So what I was trying to say through, and I think I have to refine that thought, is caste-based discrimination is to an extent similar or has a sameness with racial discrimination. Now, I think that would be the one line which Professor Shreya posed some time back. So what I have to now identify is how are they the same, while basically agreeing, okay, so the living reality is different, geographical reality is different, but to an extent, how does the discrimination is same or similar? And I think if I can come with one or two points, then I have made my point home. And I, so in the case of like Cisco, I mean, in all the three cases, they're very different. Very strategically, they're very different. Because in the case of Cisco also, they are basically relying on the Western scholarship. They are saying the same racial origin theory, that the dark complexion people are them, the Dalits. Um, in the case of, again, Chandyok versus Turkey, to an extent, it is, again, I mean, it is very difficult to argue with an anthropologist or sociologist, because the person was a Dalit, Adivasi, or rather, she was basically tribal, who was brought in, and obviously it was again then couched as a labor, or I would say wage issue or welfare issue, which became basically the discrimination happened because of a social origin. And so I think somewhere, to an extent, the courts as well as the litigants have navigated this through. And what really struck me, but given the fact that it is the de facto case of existence of Article 15, if you read 17 together with it. So as you said and rightly pointed out, okay, so this is unconscionable, done. But what ahead of that? I mean, why is it that it is also so problematic? I mean, where does the discrimination vocabulary will get in? So yeah, thank you so much. I mean, it has lent a lot of clarity, and I'm thankful to the questions that have been asked. Thank you.
In fact, your comment also reminds me that we are discussing this in the Cisco case in part because of the closed list nature of American discrimination law, right? Where the heads of discrimination can only be those that are listed, right? So we know from the discussion in the Johar case in the Indian context, Article 15, the same problem arose, right? Is Article 15 textually, it's a closed list. How do you fit in sexual orientation? Some judges used the strategy you're advocating, the expanded sex, to read in sexual orientation. I think Justice Indu Malhotra's judgment can be read as just a much more radical judgment, in that she reads Article 15 as an open list. Right? Now, obviously, that is linguistically, textually difficult, and you have to do some fancy footwork to get there. But in the Canadian context, where, for example, there's an open list, where there's a residual clause and other status, you don't need to do this, at least strategically, right? You don't need to try to fit in caste in the race box. You can just say caste is analogous to race and gender and disability and other mentioned status, right? So that's another thought. Here's a question from Aditya Roy. I think this is aimed at me, but I'll read it out first. You talked about the role of scholar and the academic as one of speaking truth to power. But their scholarship, which are based on or motivated by a particular methodology. It gives the example of Twale, feminist approaches to international law, Marxist approaches to strength. You know, I think these methods bring a sort of bias in scholarship rather than keeping it objective, unbiased and leaning more on the side of truth. However, there are others who say that as no one is apolitical, there's nothing wrong with being upfront about it and reflecting it in scholarship. So he's asking me whether this is troubling. Okay, so Aditya, thank you. That's a thoughtful question. It's something that I've thought a lot about, and what I'm going to give you is my very personal take. And if Shreya wants to jump in as well, or Surendra, please do. Which is, first, we need to make a distinction between a scholarly method and the outcome of your paper. The method is your discipline, is the lens with which you observe an issue. And what method you adopt in your research must be dictated by the question you ask. If I am interested in, say, if my research question is, how does caste operate in in how witnesses are cross-examined in murder trials. Let's say that's my research question, right? Does caste play a role in the cross-examination of witnesses in murder trials, right? If I adopt a doctrinal method or an analytic philosophical method to answer that question, I will get nowhere, right? That question, the nature of that question demands a social science method, either based on some combination of questionnaire, ethnography, sitting in courtrooms, structured questionnaire, whatever, right? So social scientists have come up with methods that are capable of answering that question. So that's the first point I want to make, that your method must be dictated by the question you are seeking to answer. The second is your method must be rigorous and robust. A method whose application predetermines the answer you're going to give, to my mind, is not a scholarly method. Scholarship demands intellectual humility. Scholarship demands that you must be open to being proven wrong. Of course, you have to have hypotheses. You have to have certain preconceptions about a question. You know, any question that you're interested in, you will have preconceptions. But you have to be able to prove yourself wrong. If not, then you're doing something else. Then you're not doing scholarship. Right? Then you're doing propaganda. If you're so convinced of your answer before you have set out to research a problem, that's not scholarship. So that is the commitment to the truth. It's a commitment to yourself as well. And speaking truth to power first requires speaking truth to yourself. So you're not an activist. So one of the key difference between the scholar and the activist, to my mind, is that the activist has certainties and the scholar has doubt. The beginning point of scholarship to me is doubt, and nothing can be so sacred that it cannot be questioned and it cannot be researched into. And so are scholars apolitical? Of course not. Nobody is apolitical. But training in scholarship must require that truth trumps politics. Say your thing, but you have to be open to the possibility that you may be wrong. And others will show you, which is why whatever argument you're providing, right? I am very sympathetic to Surendra's claims, but that hasn't stopped me from asking him some very difficult question. Do I believe that manual scavenging is caste discrimination? Of course I do. But I have asked him, why? You haven't shown it to me, right? And that is the scholarly method. That is the intellectual method, to never be satisfied by your own assumptions or anybody else's. But anyway, there are lots of other questions. We're sort of running out of time. I think I'll aim to wrap it up in another 10, 15 minutes. So a quick time to respond. If Shreya or Surendra want to say anything to this question at all. Shreya is nodding. Surendra? Okay. So let's see what other questions there are here. So there's a question from Prarthana, which is that she has two questions, one for me, one for Surendra. To me, she says, I said that the resilience of caste is that it gives every person an incentive to preserve it. Can you expand on that idea? I think the second question is to Surendra, which is that the paper seems to focus on the case of manual scavenging as an example of caste discrimination, but does not expand on other forms of caste discrimination, not explicitly mention these other forms, which are not in part of the paper. So before I leave that question to you, Surendra, and before I answer my question. So Prarthana is absolutely right in asking this question, but you are absolutely right in focusing. So I've been telling you, you need to focus more. And she's asking you to say more, right? Often in workshops, you will get participants who will tell you, oh, I need to know more about this. Take that as a compliment, because you have gotten the reader so interested in what you have said that she wants to know more. But, but don't necessarily take it as an instruction to say more about other forms of caste discrimination. I think what you said is already too much. You need to focus. So 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 take a question as a compliment. You know, she wants to know other forms of caste discrimination, but that's not what your paper is about and should not be. I think, you know, even manual scamming, I think you need to focus more rather than to say more about other forms of caste discrimination in this paper, right? But on your first question, well, it was a flippant off the cuff comment, but the idea behind it was this, right? You know, as constitutional lawyers, we are obsessed with design. Because one of the thin virtues of constitutions is, how do we achieve an idea most effectively? Good design is effective design. Right? And how do you make something effective? You ensure that a system is designed in a way that makes it self-enforcing. What is a self-enforcing system? A self-enforcing system is one where those who are most capable of making something happen also have the greatest incentive of making it happen. Right? So what is not a self-enforcing system? The Indian policing system, okay, the Indian way of policing the police, of keeping police under check, is the opposite of a self-enforcing system. When you give the police the power to make sure that the police does not torture other people, that's terrible design. Anybody can see that's bad design. Why? Because the people you're empowering have the least incentive. Asking the police to investigate into encounter deaths or torture in police custody is bad design, right? Because you're asking the same person to check themselves. What is a good design? Empowering those who have suffered the most, people who are tortured by it, for example, giving them the means to enforce it. What I said about the caste system being resilient is somewhat along those lines. It's an excellently designed system where it gives everybody an incentive to maintain the system. Because while you suffer under the system, you also get something out of it. While there is always somebody above you who looks down upon you, there's always somebody below you who makes you feel superior, right? So nobody, except unless you're absolutely at the bottom of the hierarchy. But even there is enough ambiguity that allows you to pretend to be above somebody else, and you can disagree about that, right? Two groups, both of whom think that the other one is at the bottommost, right? But that's a system where everybody has some stake in the system, and therefore you want to preserve it. Right? It's not a scholarly thought, it's an off-the-cuff remark. If you want to research on it, I'll be happy to talk to you more about it. But anyway, that was the thought behind it. Surendra, do you want to say anything about other forms of caste discrimination and why your paper does not deal with it?
Yeah, I mean, it has already been done through the work of Satish Deshpande. I mean, Srinivas. There have been way too many caste sociological and anthropological scholars. They have already done this. One reading I would definitely recommend anyone who is very interested, and I started doing that, was Indira Sahni Judgment. How Justice Pandian discusses a 1932 instance wherein some people were actually not allowed to come out in the day, so they could only come out in the night, and that injunction was because of the caste. So I think Indira Sahni Judgment is a lovely, fascinating case study of various forms of discrimination. It recognizes, I mean, it's a very different, I have very different take on the judgment, but I think I should basically restrict myself more and more to one particular form of caste discrimination rather than talking more, because then I have to draw more lines with other rather racial discrimination. And I think that will be leading to more and more threads instead of actually cutting the threads and making it one seamless web. So.
Thank you, Surendra. There are other questions. We have 3 minutes left. I'm not going to take all of them. I'll just nod at them. Pranav wants to know the role that preambles can play in interpreting various constitutional provisions. I think we're going to pass on that panel because it's a whole new topic. There's a lot of literature on that, a lot of scholarship on that, on preambles and their role in interpretation. There's another question about whether the author is contradicting himself when he says caste is discrimination. Again, I don't think that's what the author is saying, that caste, he's not saying caste is discrimination, saying caste is a ground for discrimination. But I don't think, again, this question is particularly targeted at the reading, so I'm going to pass on it. But there's a lot of writing on caste and discrimination, and I would recommend that Ravi should read some of that. Knuckles' final question, I'll treat it as the final question, and I have a short and quick answer to that. Knuckle is asking whether the idea of strict scrutiny and discrete and insular minorities from American jurisprudence has been used in India for more progressive results. Knuckle, I'm not sure that they are especially progressive concepts. They're deeply difficult and problematic concepts, and we should worry about American presence in India. My take is that the proportionality literature is a lot better for India to adopt. But having said that, yes, the Anuj Garg case in 2006 is one case amongst others that have used the idea of strict scrutiny. Gautam Bhatia has written about it. I have written about it. Again, there's a lot of literature, and I'm happy to share by email. So I know sorry if we missed out on any of your other comments. A final word to Surendra, if you want to say anything at all, by way of closing this discussion.
Yeah, I just wanted to express my gratitude to the JFF fellows, and especially you and Professor Shreya for actually taking our time and giving such a rigorous feedback and so much to think about. So I think the process of 5.5 years of the idea first coming in and then finally being on paper, and this 1.5 hour has given me much more to think about. So there's a lot of bit more clarity, and I think now I do feel a bit more confident about what I wrote, to be honest, because when I started out, as there was a question with Pratna, there's just so much there. It's just so much interesting, and that is what I was saying to you before, like how do we actually read for what we are writing? So the readings just do not end, and I think that being said, I am actually grateful to everyone who turned up today. And thank you so much, Professor Tarun, Professor Shreya. I really am grateful for your time and your interventions, and to everyone who asked a question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Surendra. You've been a model author to subject yourself to such a barrage of criticism. But let you never walk away from a JFF workshop downhearted and discredited. I'm glad that you feel upbeat because this is a fantastic paper. There's a lot here that Shreya and I loved. There are things that you need to work on, but you know, who doesn't? So congratulations, and you know, we'll have the chat later more informally to see what can be done. Thank you to all our participants. As always, we will continue this session. We'll find a better way to organize that is not trolled next time. And as ever, we will continue this format of pre-read papers. Finally, a huge thank to Shreya for engaging so deeply and so meaningfully and so kindly, and to our conveners. Thank you all. Have a good weekend, and we'll see you in October, where I think we will be discussing a paper from Sri Lanka and Sri Lankan politics. So look out to that, and thank you and goodbye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.